I'm Candace Burns, and I'm Dean of the College of Education at William Patterson University. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our president to you, Kathleen Waldron, who is an incredible advocate for education in the state and has been a great supporter of the College of Education, including its professional development school partners. And I would like her to say a few words to you before we start formally today. President Waldron.
Thank you, Candace, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third annual New Jersey Professional Development Schools Conference. It's so great to see so many people here today for this. Our College of Education, as you know, has been working with the New Jersey Center for Professional Development Schools for a while now. And we have done, I think, some very, very interesting work around the state, as have our partners and fellow university schools of ed. I just served on a statewide task force on career preparedness and college readiness. And it was a task force put together by the Commissioner of Education in the state of New Jersey with some school superintendents, school principals, some people from community colleges, and some people like me from four-year and master's institutions. I think I was the only university president on this commission, which really was designed to take a look at the high school curricula and make significant recommendations and changes to high school curricula in New Jersey, which we all know is underway around the country to the uniform core curriculum. And one of the things that I thought about as I was serving on this commission for this task force for about 4 months was how, from an administrator's point of view at a university level, how distant we can become from the lives of students, of teachers in the classroom, principals in the schools, superintendents trying to manage districts. And so I benefited from the task force, but I say this to you because I think that when I think about professional development overall for teachers and for principals, it shouldn't stop there. It should also include university administrators. And I like to think I'm a fairly seasoned president. I've been president of universities now for over 7 years and a dean before that and a whole another career before that. But it is a rapidly changing demand on public education today that I think is something that you're all struggling with, but that university presidents and college presidents need to pay a lot more attention to. So I just say that to you, not because I'm standing in front of a bunch of educators, but because just last week we finished the task force work and put forth the document to the state and are now awaiting public reaction. And I'm hoping the wrath of the teachers doesn't come down too hard on the task force because of its recommendations. But I think that this is a dialogue that must be continuing, and I'm so glad that we have this chance to dialogue today. And I thank Jane Neapolitan for coming to our campus and for being our keynote speaker today. You're quite welcome, and we're very anxious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
At the risk of sounding like the latest political jargon, I would like to give a shout out to a number of our professional development school partners. Will the people in the Professional Development Network for William Patterson University, the PIRs, principals, university supervisors, student teachers, would you mind standing up for a minute, please? Keep standing. I have to say something nice now. So, no, you have to keep standing. Okay. We just recently had our on-site visit from NCATE. Everybody knows that name sitting in this audience. And I just want to say that our Professional Development Network partners were mentioned prominently and saliently in the team's exit report. I can't say enough good things about our partners, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you very much. I would be remiss if I didn't have a long list of thank yous for this conference. I first of all want to thank our Garden State Partnership for Teacher Equality and also the New Jersey Professional Development Network who made this event possible. Thank you, Garden State Partnership. I also want to thank very specifically Sharon Leathers, David Ferrier, LaRonda Oliver, Barbara Steenstra, Nancy Norris Bauer, Dorothy Fiola, Mary Ellen Tanis, and who am I leaving out now in my long list? Margaret Rand. For making this conference possible as well. And last but not least, our very solid partnerships throughout the state, including our partners from Kane and Rowan University. Thank you all very much. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jane Neapolitan, Chair of the Department of Instructional Leadership and Professional Development at Towson University. Dr. Neapolitan received her doctorate from Teachers College, Columbia University, with a concentration in teacher education and school reform. Among her many accomplishments are chairing and managing a research and development project sponsored by the state of Maryland and the College of Education at Towson, the Institute for Professional Development School Studies. She has been lead editor of 3 books about professional development school partnerships, and she spent much of her career writing about the quality and sustainability of the PDS effort. Her most recent book, Taking Stock of Professional Development Schools, What's Needed Now, is a compelling collection of work from writers who've been active in PDS development for many, many years and who now have reviewed carefully the evidence for the effectiveness of PDS schools on many variables, including their impact on professional development, on teacher candidates, on student learning and achievement, to name a few. Importantly, this book provides careful analysis of history, trends, and issues in professional development schools and needed research in these and other areas. The authors provide solid evidence about needed steps to foster and sustain PDSs in this complex, economically and politically challenging environment. One author in Taking Stock states, "Perhaps at no other time in the history of American education have institutions and PDS partnerships felt such a dire need to assess their effectiveness, renew their vitality, and publicize their relevance to educating individuals for America's general welfare and future as a global leader." I would like to acknowledge that today's audience is very important. It has the potential to systematically collaborate to address many of the gaps in research on the impact of PDSs and to contribute to the sustainability of powerful school-university partnerships. Lee Titel's chapter in Taking Stock has a wonderful quote I just want to borrow from a minute. He says, "We must climb on. We must work and learn from each other and with each other. Our commitment to children leaves us no other choice." Dr. Neapolitan has been an active force in research on sustainability and accountability of PDSs. It's both timely and wonderful that she's agreed to be here today. Please help me welcome her.
Well, good morning. This is a very exciting day because now I have completed the trifecta of the PDS network in New Jersey. About 5 years ago, I spoke at Rowan University, and then last fall, I spoke at Kane, and now we've saved the best for last. I'm at William Patterson University of New Jersey. Woo! This is totally unlike me. I'm an introvert, but give me an audience. And I'm so excited, and thank you so much to President Waldron and to Dean Burns for your very gracious introduction. I mean, you folks really did your homework, and thank you so much. Today's talk is only, I think, the third or fourth time that I've presented it. The book was released last fall, And I've presented it twice to the Towson University PDS network and to some of the faculty. And I presented it at Kane last fall, and I'm going back to Kane in June for some more dialogue about it. But this is very new. So Maryland and New Jersey are the only states where, we're really beginning to get the word out. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that you're telling me so far that this is a very useful kind of tool and a resource for where we stand right now. So I'm basically going to give you an overview of the book, but I'm also going to focus primarily on the impacts on teacher preparation, on professional development, and on student learning. And then tie it up with some quotes from Lee Teitel as well. So let's begin. This is what the book looks like. Now, first of all, no one receives any compensation for this book. The book is published by the National Society for the Study of Education, which was founded around the year 1900. By a very small group of educational philosophers, including John Dewey. So it's a real honor, and it's very prestigious to have a topic included in the yearbook. Only 2 yearbooks are published every year, and virtually you can walk into any College of Education library in the United States, and you will find these very, very old volumes bound in leather in the old days with, gold or silver embossing on it. And so it was always a prestigious thing because in those days there were no other outlets, there were no other books or magazines or journals. So this really goes back to the heart of it, and that was very important for me to go to NSSE because I felt that professional development schools embodies so much of our democratic beliefs about education and so much about the professionalization of teaching that it really deserved to be in what I felt was the top outlet. And therefore, that's why I went that way. So bottom line is no one's making any money off of this, but we want it to be a resource for you. I'm going to focus on PDS research, policy, and evaluation because these are the things that have really driven me and kept me in this business since the year 1999. When I went to Towson University as an assistant professor in 1999, I was assigned to be a liaison or a clinical faculty or a professor in residence, as you may call it, at a place called Owings Mills Elementary School in Owings Mills, Maryland. And, excuse me, I had been really researching and reading about PDS, but I had not ever experienced it. Although my first course at Teachers College was at PS 87, which was a PDS. And I said, why the heck am I taking a class in a 4th grade classroom? I had no clue about professional development schools. And the course was co-taught by a 4th grade teacher and a professor. And so that was my introduction to PDS, and as I began to learn more about it, I was totally committed and intrigued by, how this could be used not only for teacher preparation, but for school reform. So I spent a number of years at Towson University as the liaison, and I had 18 teacher candidates under my wings at Owings Mills Elementary School, and I participated in the NCATE PDS Standards Field Test Project, and then also Maryland developed its own standards for PDS. So I had a lot of background on thinking about, what exactly is PDS in more from a definition perspective, and how would you actually evaluate the outcomes of this. So one of my driving questions that I've stayed on point for all these years is how can collaborative research be attained when universities and school systems have different purposes for and understandings of research? Yes. How many of you are mentor teachers? Classroom teachers? A few, yes. Okay, so you're doing the heavy lifting. You're at the nexus of this whole partnership thing. How many of you are teacher candidates, student teachers, interns? A few over here. I'm so glad that you came because you're going to be at the ground level of, going forward. How many of you are principals, assistant principals? A few. Thank you, because the more you understand the big picture of the professional development school, the better you can become advocates for really making the partnership hook together. How many of you are central office administrators, superintendents? A few. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come, because this really is a part of school improvement. Although we often think about it as making new teachers and having a good pipeline of new teachers, but it is much bigger than that. How many of you are professors and residents, liaisons, clinical faculty who kind of go back and forth? Yeah, and that's the majority of you. How many of you are faculty from universities, others that I did not mention? So you're faculty, and we also have people from the state, from the partnership, which is what I find very fascinating about New Jersey, because, and maybe later we can talk about this in the panel, you may know that Maryland has a state mandate that every teacher candidate must go through a PDS internship. Now, just hold your agreement or disagreement with that, because there are many implications, and I might get to talk about that later. But you have done this voluntarily, as has Pennsylvania has done it voluntarily. In Pennsylvania, it was driven by the colleges and universities, who then worked with the state to set up their system. So it works out very differently. Having a state mandate, it gives a very different twist to it. But my question was really about inquiry, and I'm so happy to see this. Your motto for the College of Education is preparing inquiring educators. Oh, I mean, that does my heart good, because inquiry is at the heart of this partnership effort. But apparently you're struggling with how do you work that out when school systems look at research and inquiry in a different way for different purposes, and the university may look at it in a different way. How do we put that together? Also, professional development school and school reform, how does that fit together? How can the PDS become a leverage for change? Because how many of you have read the NCATE PDS standards? Not the NCATE accreditation, but the ones for PDS? All right, some of you are familiar with that. I know it's very difficult. You can blame Lee Title because he was the final author on that. I happen to know that as a fact. So you can blame him if you can't totally understand it, but it's written very much in a kind of higher education language. But the point is that the NCATE PDS standards have something that's called the leading level. And at the leading level, these partnership schools are supposed to be leverages for change, for affecting policy, for moving things forward. And yet that has not always been the case. And so I'm wondering, how can we do that? Well, we've done a wonderful job on improving teacher preparation. It's deep, it's thoughtful, it's labor intensive. It's intensive for teacher candidates, for student teachers, has a very high expectation. It's all the things really that our detractors say we're not doing in teacher education. And yet we have not utilized PDS as a way to leverage other kinds of changes. I never understood why, when people were talking about charter schools when they came on the scene, and vouchers and other ways, for these mechanisms for improving education, that they never talked about professional development schools. And finally, how are we going to renew the PDS? Now, I know that last year you had Bernard Battiali spoke at this conference, and Bernard is one of the authors in this book, in fact. And he comes from the John Goodlad School, Have any of you participated in the National Network for Educational Renewal? Have you ever gone to any of those conferences? They're in Washington State. I don't see any hands. Okay, so John Goodlad, who is an educational philosopher, who is very much about education and democratic society, he really, he had his own kind of version. He called it Centers for Pedagogy, which started back in the 80s. But he was talking about partnerships, but it was much more global. It wasn't, focused only on teacher preparation. So I like to use that term renewal, and I think that we are now at this, nexus or a place in history where we can renew the PDS after 20 years. But how are we going to deal with the more standardized aspects of education in general, such as Race to the Top, the Common Core curriculum, and all these other things? We will still have mandatory testing. How do we incorporate that into the vision of professional development schools? So the purpose of the book was to leave a legacy for those who wish to study professional development schools in a very deep way. And there are many folks right now doing their doctoral dissertations, master's theses, and so forth on professional development schools. And if you go to some conferences, you may get to hear about it, to read about it. There are wonderful things. There are principals who are in doctoral programs, sometimes use their school as the laboratory for their own research. This is wonderful because we really don't know a whole lot about the impacts of being in a professional development school on school leaders, especially the principals. I'm the director of a graduate program for educational administration, and I know that my university has not really tapped into professional development schools and how that could help support really wonderful professional development for school leaders. We're kind of in our own silos, as in any institution. So we wanted, to preserve the history and the development of PDS, because you have to always look back to where this came from so that you can understand the purpose of it. And then provide a resource to scholars, but also a resource for practitioners. And since the majority of you, and I'm making this assumption, are interested in the practice, in the how do you translate the theory or the philosophy into good practice that's meaningful for all the constituents, I think that you will find some things here that will stimulate conversation so that there is a better mutual understanding across both sides. And when I say both sides, I mean between P-12 education and higher education. We really need to have both sides committed to the effort. And then to provide an evidence-based reflection on PDS in terms of where it is right now, because we don't know. And there are a number of books. Some of us may have seen this one. This is something that I edited a number of years ago. Nancy Norris Bauer is in here, and so is Martha Mobley, and some others who came to a conference at Towson University. And they're good stories and explanations of what's going on at different universities, but no one has attempted, or no group rather, has attempted to put together what we know about professional development schools based on peer-reviewed, high-quality research. And for people in my business in teacher education in higher ed, this is a battle that we fight because very often, this endeavor is expensive. And if you can't demonstrate that it's having some measurable impact on kids, on teachers, on professional development, then why are we doing this? At Towson University, where we're the largest provider of teachers to the state of Maryland, the PDS endeavor costs more than $500,000. It's more than $500,000. That's a very modest estimate. A few years ago, Towson University received $600,000 from the state of Maryland, from the legislature, but that was a one-time deal. And then right after that, everything began to go south because, like most states, we're in a deficit mode right now. But we had that one shining moment. And we virtually now receive no funding from the state, even though it's a state mandate, and we still have to do it in order to maintain program approval from the state. So now I'm going to tell you about the book and how it's organized. And as I take you through the organization, you might want to make note of some things that, perhaps you want to read about. You may recognize some of the authors. And then after I walk you through the book in general, I'm going to talk more specifically about the impacts. Okay, so very quickly, the history, vision, and approaches to PDS. This is the part that we wanted to preserve for those people that come after us who have really no idea of what the Holmes Group was about, or the National Association of PDS, and where it all came out from. In Chapter 1, the purpose and the vision of PDS is written by Dr. Allison Rutter at East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. And Allison Rutter is a past president of the National Association of PDS. And she looks at all of the teacher reform movements, a lot of national reports that came out of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that led up to the call for the professionalization of teaching. How many of you are National Board Certified Teachers? One. She does it very meekly. Yes, well, you should be very proud of that accomplishment, because it really does relate to this bigger trend of professionalizing teacher education, which, as we know, has always been at the bottom of the food chain in higher education. And now it has been elevated as a profession, at least in some people's minds. The ones who care about it, it does matter to us, and we know that it is unconditionally. In the second chapter, The Approaches to PDS, that's written by Marcia Levine of NCATE and myself. And Marcia and I have worked together closely for a number of years in developing the standards, the PDS standards from NCATE, as well as the Maryland standards. But we looked at different approaches. What are the philosophies? And we found that there are two approaches, and one is to provide support, sort of kumbaya, let's feel good, let's get together, let's share. But the other group is the group that said, PDS is a very fragile institution. I mean, think about it. It was built on goodwill. Goodwill between schools and universities and colleges that prepare teachers. The schools that you've always gone to and cared about. And you've had a relationship with each other for many, many years before we ever called it a PDS, right? Because we needed each other. But that's very fragile. How do you then put a frame around it to support it so it can go into the future? And that's what the NCATE tried to do, and Maryland tried to do, to somehow put a frame and to put some standardization to it, so that not every kind of partnership was a PDS. The response to that is written by Ken Howie. And Ken Howie is now retired, but he works with the Rockefeller Institute in New York. And yes, he is married to Nancy Zimpher, who is the chancellor of the SUNY system now. But Ken Howie and Nancy Zimpher made it the Holmes partnership. When they were in Ohio, they were the ones that said, look, we work with school systems, we work with superintendents. This initiative cannot just be about deans, with all due respect to Dr. Burns. This can't just be about deans. We have to have our school partners. And he writes a very, very nice reflection on that piece. And believe me, it was such a thrill to ask one of my heroes to write that chapter. Okay, so the heart of the book is really in this section 2, measuring the effectiveness of PDS. And this is where there is the most that has been written, that has been published, that you can find, that you can work with. And chapter 4 is the impact on PDS preparation on teacher candidates. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that specifically. It's written by my friend, Dr. Sharon Castle, who just retired from George Mason University, and Miss Kathleen Riley, who was at George Mason University, and I'm proud to say is going to be an assistant professor in my department. So sometimes, we scout good people, right? And so Kathleen Riley's coming to Towson University. Their chapter had the most to work with, because most of the research and most of the published documentation is on the impacts on teacher preparation, because that's what we put most of our energy in. Chapter 5 is the impact on professional development, and that's written by Jim Nolan at Penn State University, who is a colleague of Bernard Battiali's. Also, Jim Nolan had a principal and a PDS liaison or a professor in residence and a couple of other people. He had a real team work on that chapter. I will talk a little bit about the impact on that. Part of our challenge was not only to summarize what we found in the research, but then we also had to critique the state of the research in order to give people direction and to sort of explain that some of this is not, really solid. But, the irony is that the National Society for the Study of Education was formed because they wanted to have, in their original name, it said the National Society for the Scientific Study of Education. That was in 1900. They put the word scientific in there because you see that even then, they were trying to make this something that was a legitimate area for research and study, that it was a scientific methodology. So, and I have worked with, a number of detractors out there who say that the research on PDS is really, it's bad, it's soft. And that, unfortunately, has convinced some deans to say, we can't afford this, we're not going to do it. Maybe you've heard the stories too, when you talk to people saying, we don't do PDS anymore because the commitment was not there. And so, because people are looking for something that's conclusive. Okay, so finally in Chapter 6, PDS and Student Learning and Achievement, that was written by two folks in California. Dr. Ron Glass from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Ron Glass has really been a big researcher in bilingual education for many years. And he's now the director of a center for something like research in equity in California. I mean, it has a real kind of social consciousness title, but he has he just got a big grant from the Spencer Foundation. And he and his co-author, Dr. Pia Wong, who is at Cal State Sacramento, the two of them, they've written a book and done a number of presentations on PDS, especially the impacts on children, including children living in poverty, children who are English language learners, and so forth. And I had a very hard time finding somebody who was an expert on the impacts of the professional development school model on children. Because that, for me, as a researcher, that's where the rubber meets the road. You have to have trust and rapport. You have to be on the same page with your partners to have access to certain things, to certain information, to go in and to do observations, to collect data. And if you have accomplished that, I applaud you, because that is not an easy task. But I think that when school districts and their local universities and colleges have a relationship where they depend on each other to be successful for kids and to help the community, it helps this research agenda. Money talks, I know, but you can't go in and build trust and rapport overnight. Yeah, you can. You can get cooperation, but then once the grant is over, it's over. And we're at a point now where we have to make some difficult decisions about that and have those conversations about, can we use our resources to continue this? If we really care, if we're really committed to working with each other for kids. So the response chapter to PDS and the professionalization of teaching is written by Lynn Goodwin, who's the Associate Dean at Teachers College at Columbia University. And she, oh my gosh, I wish we had taped her, her presentation at AERA a year ago back in New Orleans, because she did talk about the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and PDS, and how the PDS has really unconditionally proven that teaching is a profession. It has raised it by the quality, the expectation, the feedback, the research all points to the fact that it is indeed a profession writ large. And yet, our detractors still want to say, you know, you're not doing a good job. So that's why we have to get this word out. You know, we have to be courageous. In section 3, I wanted something about PDS's leverage for change. I mean, that's kind of where we want to go for the future. And in Chapter 8, the self-assessment, program evaluation, and renewal was written by Bernard Battiali of Penn State University, and he's now the past president of the National Association of PDS. And if you are interested in kind of taking your renewal or self-assessment to a higher level, I recommend that you read that chapter, because he looks at evaluation models that have been used for schools, for universities, and he purports a kind of collaborative evaluation model. That I think we're probably going to see some of that. I know that we're dealing with those other types of things that are coming, you know, from the federal and state level that are sort of one-sided. But when you begin to try to evaluate something that's very complex, like a PDS or a partnership, you can't rely on a single model, because the one size will not fit. So now we're talking about mixed methods and models that use some, you know, standardized test data, some observations, that use a variety of evidence in order to assess and to evaluate the partnership. And he does a very good job in thinking outside the box for that. How many of you have participated in action research in some shape or form? Participated in it? And now, how about you teacher candidates? You've got to do student action research? Hopefully, yes, good. Right, so, I mean, action research is written all throughout the Maryland PDS standards. You know, or inquiry. Sometimes people don't like to use the word action research because it means different things to different people. But there's been a lot of action research presented, a lot of it has been written up. But my colleague, Jean Tunks from the University of North Texas, and she works with the Denton public school system. And their PDS is actually the whole school system, where they have many children living in poverty, many children who are Latino. She looked at the action research and she did kind of like an analysis. And she said that, ironically, most of the publications on action research are actually written by university professors, university faculty, who are writing about teachers doing action research. So it's research on other people rather than the voices of teachers coming through in an authentic way. So that's something to think about. Are classroom teachers engaged in action research in a way that they can reflect on it and have their voice there as well? I know that many of us are working with teacher candidates, student teachers, interns, and teaching them about action research. And it fits in beautifully because now you have to provide evidence that you're impacting student learning, student achievement. I get it. But have we really engaged mentor teachers and other teachers who are in the PDS to participate in action research as a way of professional development, of developing their own understanding of their practice? Because we don't have a lot of evidence that all of the professional development that we do vis-a-vis the PDS partnership is actually coming back into the PDS and has a connection to student outcomes. it's kind of a lost opportunity. Now, I know you're going to say to me, who the heck is going to do all this work? Because it is, it's a big thing. But that's why I'm asking that we have to step off the merry-go-round, at least for a couple of days in the summer, or whenever you have, a planning institute, whatever you call it, to talk about these things, on how can you build that in, because we're not capturing all of the good stuff that we've done. We know from our experience, anecdotally, we've lived it, you've seen it, you hear the stories, but we're not providing that to the people that make the decisions for the policy, for the money. In the state of Maryland, this is a bird walk, but I hope I have time. A few years ago, in Maryland, even though it was a state mandate, and it's been a mandate since about 2003 that we have professional development school experience for all candidates. Our legislators did not know what a professional development school was. Nobody went, to Annapolis and said, hey, guess what? Ladies and gentlemen, in your district, there are these 3 schools that are partners with Johns Hopkins or Towson University or Loyola University. And here are the wonderful things and the benefits that the children in your district are receiving. No one ever thought to do that. That's a shame that we did not seize the moment early on. But, we took the directive from the State Department of Education, and we said yes, and there was great professional development across the state, great networking. And then one day, they said, oh, and also when you have your NK visit, you also have your program approval visit from the state, and then we're going to evaluate your PDS. And that kind of took the air out of that balloon to a certain extent, because now it was not so much a voluntary act, but rather something that was mandated. It became more like, we have to do it, and it became more of a checklist. So here we go on chapter 12. What do we know about accountability and resources in PDS? Well, the author was Diane Yendall Hoppe from the University of South Florida. I know she's moved around a few times. But Diane Yendall Hoppe and Jason Smith from West Virginia University had a really difficult time writing this chapter on accountability. They thought, oh, well, everybody uses the PDS standards, blah, blah, blah. You go to any presentation, they'll say, oh, yes, and we use NK. But when you start talking to people and saying, well, what's the accountability system? Do you have to collect data? Who does it go to? Do you use it for improvement? Those kinds of questions didn't have, some really solid answers. So, Diane cursed me up and down because she said, why did you make me write this chapter? I said, Diane, you said it was important. You wanted to do it. But then she found out there was nothing to find when she did a literature review or a search. So she ended up, through the connections with the NAPDS, on actually doing a survey, and sent out a survey to directors of PDS and talking to people about how they used standards or what the accountability was. So that's a piece that's really not always there. We have a lot of, and I'm not talking about this group at all, but I mean, in some places, can you imagine, if you're a small college, in a rural area and you're not connected to a metropolitan area, you may not, be able to do this PDS thing in a way that we're talking about it, the way you all experience. It's quite different. And so what's the accountability there? Are they supported in any way? So that's a very interesting chapter about, that there's really a lot lacking, and that we still do a lot of this on good faith, I think. In chapter 13, the issues of PDS accountability and sustainability in today's complex educational environment, is written by Dr. Donna Wiseman, who is the dean at the University of Maryland at College Park. I think she's also on the AACT board. She's on a number of boards. And Donna has studied partnerships for many, many years. I mean, she's a dean that, her scholarship has been based on this. And she writes about the fact that that the professional development school can no longer, just be the bailiwick of the college or the university. And the control cannot be there because of today's educational complex educational environment. If we don't expand to the community and because you may not know this, or maybe you do, that when the Holmes Group back in the 1980s conceived of this partnership, they said, quote, "The PDS is a school university community partnership." It had 3 parts. But over the years, that community piece has dropped off. And we don't call it a school-university community partnership. But now is a good time, because the community has to be engaged. And therefore, one way for us to help sustain the PDS and to reinvent it or renew it is to bring the community more into play. I mean, I've seen it happen in many places where the community now has a seat at the table, whether you call it a PDS council or some kind of governance group in the partnership. They really need to be there. It's not just about student-teacher placements. And I know that the conversation always devolves or is reduced to, do you put 5 interns into a school? Oh, we have 10. I can't find a place for 10. And I know that these are the realities for directors of field placement officers and directors of PDS, but if the conversation is only about the operations, we're never going to utilize this. It's going to drop off the vine. We can't stay at the level of operations. We have to get everyone, even if you think that that's not your concern, we have to get everyone on a different plane to brainstorm how we're going to go forward and how we're going to use some of this information. Okay, so now what you've been waiting for are the impacts. As I said, the first chapter, the impacts on professionalization of teaching. We know this, and read that chapter from Sharon Castle. PDS candidates are more effective in a variety of instructional methods and processes, such as planning, assessment, and classroom management, as compared with candidates who do not go through a PDS internship or experience. Okay? The comparative studies have been done. We know that PDS candidates are better prepared to teach diverse students in high-need settings, and that is because a large majority of PDS schools are in high-need settings because of the commitment of the colleges and schools of education and the commitment of the P12 partners that we work with. We want to put the best resources into schools where it's needed. We also know that candidates display greater capacity for a range of professional behaviors, such as collaboration, reflection, and inquiry. And I was having this wonderful conversation over dinner last night with Nancy Norris Bauer about the fact that, you just went through NCAPE, many of you did, and others of you have gone through that as well. And there's this thing called dispositions, professional dispositions. How do you measure that? And yet, we know as teacher educators, as teachers, as school administrators, as school leaders, that if a person doesn't have the right stuff, the right character, the right dispositions, commitment, being skilled at all this stuff, the Common Core curriculum, which is great. I mean, I support it in many ways. But that's only technical skills. What's been lost is, do we have the people who want to do this for the long haul or see it as a future for them for making a difference in any capacity, either as a classroom teacher, as a department chair, as an assistant principal, and so forth? Do they have that commitment? And it's really hard now because we know that young people have so many other choices. And so many other choices that are more lucrative, but perhaps not as satisfying. It's always wonderful to have a person come to you and say, well, I'm 30 years old and I started out doing, business or doing something to make my parents happy, but my mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and now I want to become a teacher. I mean, I have a son who was a computer scientist, and then at age 25 decided that he wanted to teach and gave it all up. Now, of course, he's a professor because, that's what he wanted, but he loved teaching. And he's an excellent teacher in a field that's not really known for really good teaching, by the way. So he's doing, he's found his niche. But how do we get people then that are really interested in teaching in terms of making a difference? That's the moral commitment, which is really the underlying crux of all of this, is that we need people who want to make a difference. And it's a moral obligation. And so knowing about how to deliver a good lesson and how to collect data on student learning and all of that is important. But if you don't have the right dispositions and the right set of skills, especially interpersonal skills, you're not going to stay in it for the long haul. And so we know then that teacher candidates demonstrate a greater readiness for teaching. At Towson University, we now have Dr. Nancy S. Grasmick, the former state superintendent of instruction for 20 years in Maryland, the longest run as a state superintendent of instruction. She's now our presidential scholar in residence. And she wrote a letter a number of years ago, and I photocopied it because I've used it so many times. It says that teacher candidates that graduate from Towson University's teacher preparation program are more like second-year teachers than first-year teachers. And that's because of the excellent preparation they received through the professional development school, that their experiences have prepared them for the 21st century in a much more intensive and extensive way. And yesterday, I had a very long conversation with Nancy about PDS. And maybe, I'll add some of that later. The impact on veteran teachers, there's not as much to go on, but that has been studied. And again, engaging teachers in an authentic way would help us to demonstrate this, which I think would be very good, because now we're all going to be looking at teacher evaluation, unfortunately, in a new way through Race to the Top. I know in Maryland we have to do that now because we have to show that, that student achievement accounts for 50% of a teacher's evaluation and all of that. So now as we're struggling with these things, I think it's a good time for PDS to begin to kind of seize some of these opportunities in partnership with the school system. Jim Nolan found that teachers develop an expanded view of their roles that goes beyond the classroom, and that is the definition of teacher leadership. Teachers don't look at the responsibility confined by the four walls of their classroom. Rather, they make a contribution to the whole school program. And that's what my own research on teacher leadership has shown me. I interviewed many principals, and they all said the same thing. A teacher leader makes a contribution to the whole school program. Is also an excellent teacher that is effective, impacts student learning in measurable ways, but also makes a contribution to the whole school. Veteran teachers mentor interns and engage in action research inquiry that facilitates this perspective. They have the aha. Okay, I'm looking at things differently because I'm also inquiring about it. Teachers become more reflective about their teaching practice and grapple more readily with the theory-practice dichotomy than teachers not in PDS. Now, when I have been in schools and spent time there, or when I was a teacher, people would say, oh, the research, you can find research that says one thing and something that contradicts it. Just dismiss it. We don't believe in it. We believe in best practices. Well, I'm not really sure all the time what best practices are either, because I have, my own students who are preparing to be assistant principals come from a wide range of best practices, from Baltimore City all the way out to the suburbs, and they're not all the same. So I'm not really sure how we define that. So in order to get a handle on what are best practices, then we need to engage teachers more in the inquiry. But teachers are more capable of dealing with the dissonance, the discord, rather than becoming frustrated. And that's through professional learning communities in PDS, where teachers have an opportunity to talk about things at this level of, problem solving and conceptualizing rather than simply implementing. We really need to have a connection between the two, and the partnership can help facilitate that. However, there's scant research on how teachers have changed their teaching practices as a result of engagement with PDS. I see Nancy taking notes. I see others taking notes. That would be a perfect place to zone in on in order to find out how teachers have changed their teaching practice, because wouldn't it be wonderful to say to your school board or whomever that, teachers in these schools that are partnership schools have changed their practices in certain ways, however you have documented that. Now, impacts on university faculty. These are probably less giddy. And university faculty are, they sometimes tell us some sobering things about this. The changing roles of university faculty. Dream keepers, weavers, and shapeshifters. So you decide what you are. If you are the professor in residence, your tenure track faculty, you're keeping the train. You've got to keep this alive. And you say, this is up to me. I'm here from the university and I'm working in the school 2 or 3 times a day. I have to keep this alive. Some of us, though, we weave between the two, the school's world, the university's world. Some of us are shapeshifters. I know, you're thinking of that program that's on HBO, right? True Blood? I hear some laughs, so I won't say any more. But there are shapeshifters, people who, sometimes an animal, sometimes a human. And there are also those who either build new structures because you don't have them, or they bridge existing structures and find ways to make connections. That's all. Those are all very interesting metaphors. The perceived benefits and drawbacks, the length of time in the PDS engagement, connection to one's area of expertise. If a professor is interested in reading, is doing research in reading, and the PDS engages the professor in some professional development that they can provide for reading or do research about reading, you have that person hooked. It's a good match. Sometimes those matches don't happen. It's the way you deploy people, the way you utilize them in a thoughtful way. And then finally, faculty do find an increased workload and a balance between PDS obligations and academic responsibilities. I think that Towson University has done a good job of making PDS work count towards promotion and tenure, but that still remains a challenge at many places. Impacts on PDS principals. We don't know a whole lot, but this is a growing area. Principals have 2 different approaches. One is an organizational focus. The principal sees that PDS is definitely increased workload resulting from PDS. It can either be apart from, it's separate from my daily work, or it's also integrated and is a part of my daily work. Some principals are bystanders. They don't get in the way, but they don't have a lot of direct involvement, but they support it. Some are distributors. They go, aha, I am going to seize this opportunity in my leadership authority. I am going to distribute this among the faculty. And that's what Chet Scott at Owings Mills Elementary School has done for over 10 years. He said, I want to have fantastic teachers who are motivated in my school, and I'm going to have leadership teams, and teachers are team leaders, and that was really the driving force for him to become a professional development school. And others are knowledge managers. Like, there's information here. I've attended some of the PDS meetings, the conferences. They are visible right along with higher ed folks, which is great because they are fully participating and they are using that knowledge and managing it in different ways. Some principals are focused on themselves as gaining professional development. They know more about national trends and so forth, but they also understand teacher preparation, which I think is pretty much a mystery. If you go directly into school administration and you haven't worked with universities in any way, you've never really learned about teacher preparation. You went through it, but you don't know about it as a field. And then finally, the impacts on students. Well, this does not come as a surprise to me. Tutoring is the #1 documented practice in PDS for improving student achievement, and probably because of No Child Left Behind. There is funding, especially for teacher candidates, to do before school, after school tutoring, sometimes during the day. People have utilized that in a number of creative ways. But it's the #1 documentation. We don't really have a lot of research about, true connections in a more robust research approach. But we know that the tutoring, the pre, the post, maybe teacher candidates do this for their action research or service learning. It's utilized in a number of ways. Ron Glass, though, I told you he's the guy from California that has that big research center now in Santa Cruz. He talks about the commitment to the welfare of the client, that the professional development school also sees the client not only as children but also as parents, or it can, if you expand it to a community proposition. And he and Pia Wong do again, a review of the research, and they see that there's some evidence regarding higher test scores and other student gains resulting from a variety of curricular and instructional innovations and interventions, all introduced by PDS partnerships. That's important because these interventions or these approaches would not have happened unless the university had been sitting at the table when the decisions were made. So let's say that there were new state standards or a state testing program. If you didn't have university folks there who may be approaching it differently or who have different knowledge to share, then things would not have been modified. So it's not, either or. It's not strictly what the school district and the state are asking. It's not strictly, what Professor Smith wants to do for his research project. No. It's a true deliberation. And so these kinds of things have impacted kids. We have impacted curriculum. When I say we, higher education has impacted curriculum, but probably not as broadly as we would like. I know that this is difficult. I did an evaluation of Buffalo State College's PDS, which is very, very large. And I saw that, the curriculum in the school system, especially in the city of Buffalo, became problematic for the reading professors at Buffalo State because they didn't agree with scripted curriculum. And yet, I think that, if you have trust at somewhere and understanding that at some level, people could put it together. But that says to me then that maybe the professional development school is just seen as, oh yeah, that's that thing over there with the teachers, we have the student teachers, and it's separate from curriculum and instruction. So that's a lost opportunity as well. And then finally, how can schools and universities develop reliable measures of learning? Not only the test scores that are going to come from the state testing program, but other reliable measures. And this is where universities can work with, the Office of Assessment or whoever, or the research office in the school district. But again, there has to be some trust, and then the whole issue of confidentiality and all of that. But it can be done. It has been done. But we're not, challenging ourselves to kind of go there because that's really what's going to help to hold this all in place. And basically, Ron Glass says, that we know that PDSs have been a force for producing authentic, rigorous measures of student learning and achievement, but we haven't really used that in terms of experiments that prove the connection. And everyone wants causality. Everyone wants to say, these inputs have direct connection to these outcomes. But there's that black box in the middle. The educational world has changed. All right, what about simultaneous renewal? And this comes from Lee Teitel, and I know that Lee Teitel was your speaker a couple of years ago. Lee came out of hiding, as it were, to write the chapter, the afterword for the book. And I met up with Lee. I've known him for 10 or 13 years. But I met up with him a few years ago. He and I spoke at the first West Virginia statewide PDS conference. And it was pretty eye-opening. You probably don't know that actually Lee Teitel was never a teacher-educator, but rather he was the director of a program for school administration at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And so now he's working with folks from Harvard, bringing school leadership preparation to developing nations. And he just kind of fell into the PDS thing because he was interested on how are you going to assess it from a school district's perspective. And that's how he became involved with it. And so in West Virginia, he's talking to people. And West Virginia's been using the PDS model, same length of time as Towson University, one of the first states in the country to use it. And he said, so, how's PDS going on here, He spoke to Van Dempsey. Those of you who go way back in PDS, Van Dempsey had been at West Virginia University. He was one of the first gurus. And he speaks to Van, and Van's like, oh, it's a struggle. And Lee's like, I never thought after 10 or 12 years that you would tell me that it's a struggle in West Virginia. It was one of the first states. And he said, yeah, but you don't, the landscape has changed, which is true. Because the professional development school movement came out of the multicultural, expanding opportunities for all people movement. And then it bumped up against the standards movement when it began to take hold. And perhaps the standards movement and then the schools then also feeling the pressure from No Child Left Behind, the political landscape changed and it wasn't really ripe for this kind of innovation, but I think, we're coming back to it. So he was taken aback by this. But and I borrowed this from him, he presented it in West Virginia. Maybe he presented it to you 2 years ago also, I don't know. But he talks about this continuum of partnership, and it's actually a theory that comes from transformational leadership development. He talks about no connections. The P-12 schools on one side, the universities on the other. They exist, in the same locale, but they don't really work with each other. Then there's the transactional level, and most of us have probably been stuck in the transactional level, where we cooperate with each other. It's an exchange movement. I mean, I've written that, it's an exchange. There's a common purpose, and there are adjustments. We accommodate each other, and then we continue. And we feel that, that's good, right? Because everybody walks away from the table getting what they want or they compromise. But the transformational level is where there's collaboration on substantive issues. Many of the things I just talked about. Teacher evaluation, teacher induction, student achievement, the curriculum, also the purpose of our schools. Where are we headed? Do we have courage to go back to the values that the community needs, the values that the community wants? And do we have interdependence and trust? That trust issue was written about in the very early days of the PDS effort. And now we need it more than ever. And so those of you who have been in this field for a long time, in the field of education, who have worked with professional development schools, and those of you who are just entering it now, I want you to know that your personal integrity, your character, who you are, really matters. Not your title, not whether or not you became the teacher of the year, when you so deserve it. It's not about you, it's about us. And when I say us, I mean children and parents. It's about us doing this together. And so Lee says, what's needed now? Courage. And I've said that several times. It is about courage. This is the time to have the difficult discussions. Not every school can become a PDS. Not every school that has the title of the PDS is really living up to the challenge. And it's not its fault. Maybe we shouldn't put that expectation on it. Maybe we need to go back and rethink who would be the professional development schools and who would be other extended partners. And West Virginia University has done this. They've totally rethought the set of schools that they work with. So Lee says, you need courage of conviction, courage of belief, courage to make partnering work. And I love this quote. We cannot keep walking away from each other, or not talking to people we do not like, or feeling self-satisfied by the partial gains made by our transactional partnerships. Our commitment to children leaves no choice. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.
They have a capstone class.
And I would like to introduce the moderator today for the panel discussion. And I'm delighted she was willing to do this. She's a colleague and a counterpart at Kane University, the director of the Teaching Performance Center, Dr. Martha Mobley.
Well, thank you, and good morning to you. And again, a welcome to our friend and colleague, Jane Neapolitan, and to all of our friends and colleagues from across the state who are sitting here at the panel. So let me see if I can remember who they are, because you can see their names, and you're in a better position to see their names than I am. But from my right and to your left, I'm starting with Jane Neapolitan, and then our lovely Dean, Candace Burns, and now I go to first names, so bear with me. The next one is Joanne, then Patrick. Peggy Lewis is from Ball State. She is a visitor. We have met her repeatedly at our visits around the country, and Peggy has agreed to fly to Newark, and she has a tale to tell about that. Next to her is a teacher from Patterson Schools. First name is Carlene. And then my colleague and friend, Frank Lineberry, who is a clinical instructor for us at Kane University. So we have a little bit of Kane, we have a little bit of William Patterson, we have Rowan represented. Ball State is the oddball in here, so that we have an out-of-state perspective. And Peggy is the director of their network. That's her sole job. She's not trying to do 16 other things like Nancy and I do on a regular basis. So she's giving me the evil eye, so I must have misspoken. Forgive me, Peggy, what that is. But anyway, today the panel's focus is to respond, if you will, to Jane's comments this morning and or one of Jane's books. And I'm going to start this panel discussion because Jane kind of tantalized my thinking as we sat and listened to her, and I'm an inveterate note taker. Now, it happened when I did my doctorate. Everything had to get written down so because I could never remember it, I had to be able to bring it back up again. So if it wasn't written down, is the mantra in my office, it never happened. And that goes to the supervisor supervisors, that goes to the clinical instructors, and even my secretaries are beginning to say, it didn't happen, it's never written down, there's no evidence. I think, well, yes, we have made impact on that. But the one thing that Jane said that resonated with me, and perhaps it will with you as well, is that she gave a variety of personality titles. And so I'm going to ask for each one of you, and Jane, you can join this party if you want, or you can step out. I want to know, who's the dream keepers? How do you see yourself? Are you a dream keeper? Are you a weaver? Are you a shape shifter? Are you a builder? Or are you a bridger? Now, one of the ads that she didn't use, that Ken Zechner uses, is hybrid. That you can put any place you want in it. Jane, you want to play, or you want to step out?
I'll just say very quickly, I'm a dream keeper, because now that we're all friends here, I was a teacher dropout. So I understand what that feels like, to go through teacher preparation and to find out that you're not really equipped to do everything, that there's some of the supports are not in place, and to be very disappointed, especially as the first person in your family to go to college. Everybody said you were such a smart kid, and then you feel like a failure because teaching is just beyond your grasp. The realities of teaching in a school was not like student teaching. And so when I learned about this model, it made complete sense to me, because, you know, I'm still here. I'm still a teacher, and now I've become a dream keeper for this, so that's why it's personally very important to me.
How about you, Candace? Thank you, Jane.
I was thinking about the word hybrid, and I thought maybe Hydra is a better description. I'm not sure. I guess my goal is to be a dream keeper, and some of that involves, as Nancy tells me, getting finances and resources to help support the dreams in my college, and so that's what I want to be when I grow up.
Thank you. How about you, Joanne, as principal? Which role do you see yourself doing?
Well, I think in my role as a principal, it's unique for me to see myself as owning a little piece of each, because depending on the circumstance, as the leader, I have to be able to determine what's necessary for us to move forward. So when I think about it, I see myself as having a little piece of everything.
Patrick?
Martha, I think if I were going to choose a type, it would be a weaver. And I see myself weaving myself into the fabric of the school that I'm in, into the context, and coming to understand the people that I'm working with, and understanding that I'm just part of that tapestry that's being woven.
Thank you. Peggy?
Maybe it's my nature, but I think that I have to say that I do take little pieces from everywhere. I don't know that I can ever be committed to one thing, but I definitely see the dream keeper part of it. When I first started on this road as that one title that I have, that's just the one piece of with the professional development schools, I knew nothing about professional development schools 7 years ago. And once I started being involved, I thought there is no other answer. I see that as what we need to be doing. And so I've kept that dream alive. In the meantime, I've seen that dream wane with others. And so I do see that's my job, to keep that dream alive. But then I start weaving it amongst all the other people, because I am the bridge between faculty, between schools, between administration. So it has to be more than a dream to keep it alive. I have to have some validation, some proof, some evidence, and some plans. So there's that building too. I have to pull that one in, but always bridging between everybody, saying, here's a new step to take. Let's get to this next destination. So a little bit of all of them.
Carlene?
I believe that I can pride myself in saying that I'm a bridger. And as a bridger, I serve as a master collaborator within the context of my classroom. I work from a strengths perspective. My social work background allows me to conduct needs assessments. And so as a result, I'm able to identify, key stakeholders. and see what everybody brings to the table and see how I can best facilitate the process of learning for my students. So as a bridger, I am part and parcel of everything else.
Frank?
I would consider myself initially as the builder. I was appointed to the job of clinical instructor for a middle school in Rawway that did not have the connection with Kane University before. So I actually built the program from the ground up when I started. And that would be to have have the students, the teachers have confidence in me, be able to line up cooperating teachers. So I had to do a lot of that work ahead of time, and that was about 7 years ago. So at that time, I definitely was a builder. Now, more of a dream weaver, trying to weave some of the things that Jane had talked about into what we're doing every single day.
Thank you. Jane, you gave us a lot of information about a lot of things. So who wants to start in the conversation or give a reaction in a broader sense to some of Jane's comments? Go ahead, Frank, you're on.
I just think that at Rawway Middle School, we have 6 schools, and we have clinical instructors in every school. We have my colleagues are here today in the audience. And I think we're very fortunate to have superintendents, actually 3 superintendents in the last 6 years, who have really embraced the program. And we see many of the things that Martha and our group discuss on the college level, we bring it back to the schools, and the superintendents implement those things. One of my colleagues, Rocco, gave us some information about the book by Doug Lemove on Teach Like a Champion. And we love some of the things that Doug had said about questioning skills and how to really encourage students in the learning process. Well, we talked to our superintendent, and the superintendent has given that book to every administrator, and every administrative council meeting, there's a chapter of that book that he discusses. That came from us. So that partnership between the university and Rawway School District has been great, and we certainly want it to continue that way. So that's something that I really enjoyed hearing from Jane, and I know that we're doing that at Rawway.
Peg?
One of the things that I heard was something about having, you have to have something more than caring to continue a partnership. And I think caring is a foundation of it. And I say this all the time to everyone I talk to about, but PDS is all about relationships. It's all about trust. It's all about caring. And you can't, I mean, it's so embedded in the people who get involved in the schools, or vice versa, the teachers in the schools. It's a very strong caring relationship. But then when I put on my other hat and I start talking to administrators, either at the school level or at the university level, I start thinking, well, I have to say something to them that's beyond caring. So another piece of what Jane was talking about resonated with me was how to get the voice of the teachers out with what's happening in the research, what they're finding out in the classroom. I think, to me, that was the key that I have to take back and start working on. I think, for example, in our area, the use of 8 steps, the 8 steps program is huge right now. I don't know if you folks are seeing that as a response to intervention type of thing. And it's all about 8 steps. It's not scripted, but it's close. It's about developing curriculum calendars and maps and teachers benchmark testing and a lot of things like that. Well, our PDS schools have certainly seen a lot of effects from that, and positive effects. So I think the next thing is to get the teacher voices in. What has their experience been, especially with the PDS liaison that's at the school, the faculty member, and start getting some information out to the school board, to the parents, and to other stakeholders. So the caring piece and the teacher voices just went together for me.
I want to comment on that, and it just struck me, we have teachers with us today, collaborating teachers, and I'm wondering whether once they have stopped being a collaborating teacher for a particular student, are we keeping a record of their experiences and what they learned as a result of being a collaborating teacher, and how important that growing body would be to the field. So we need to know what were the changes that were brought about by being a collaborating teacher, working with another young adult or not so young adult in the classroom.
Somebody else have a comment?
I just wanted to
Candace?
add, if I might, I agree with you on what you said with the teachers lending their voice to the discussion and being the primary reporting of information. Also, data-driven instruction is like a key, phrase that we're hearing these days. And I think at the crux of the professional development schools model is the fact that we have the manpower in the form of the tutors who come through, or even the student teachers and practicum teachers who can design the instrument that will assess student performance pre and post, implement whatever program or curriculum is identified as being effective or potentially effective in affecting student learning in a positive way, and also in gathering the data. And so I think if William Patterson, if I can present my idea, can move from being a teaching institution to maybe a more research rich school, is to utilize what you have at your disposal in the form of those students who, for credits, will do whatever you say they do, and it will be purposeful in increasing the credibility and professionality of the teaching profession, for lack of a better term. And so that is what I took away from Ms. Neapolitan, in that it echoed my sentiments on how do we operationally define data-driven instruction outside of just relying on what someone else is reporting, rather than being the source from where that information is generated.
Candace, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I may add to it by saying something different.
That's perfect.
It's okay. I was just thinking about our conversations that we've had with our school partners and with our advisory groups and varied constituencies about how wonderful we all think we are, but how little the public knows about us. And so Jane's collection really resonated with me. It's like, how do we develop the right words in the right order, in the right time, to emphasize what we do and to put it forward and to show that we're having an impact. And that, to me, is the big dilemma I see in your book, Jane. And that is something that I think, I'll just say as a dean of the College of Education, I'm not very good at yet, but I want to be better at. And I have somebody to my right who's quite good at it. Joanne Cardillo makes a compelling case for professional development schools. And this isn't fair, but I'm going to tap Joanne to say sort of how she speaks that language, and maybe it could give us some courage and insight about how we make a case. So.
It's so funny that you said that, because we didn't talk before, but what I came here hoping to hear was for us to be able to work through that process and get good at just exactly what Dean Burns is talking about. I think I come at this from a strength and a weakness perspective. So the PDS, what is the strength of the PDS for us? The strength is that as a school district, it allows us, those of us who are part of the network, to develop specific programs and protocols in our schools that help us to move the reform forward in terms of making our schools and student achievement come to the forefront. However, it's not a cookie-cutter approach, right? So therefore, if it is not, and it should not be, because each of our schools is unique in, first of all, in our needs, in our neighborhoods, in our approaches, then how do we find a way to take that, all of that terrific stuff, and make ourselves be accountable to ourselves, to the university as a partner, but most of all to our board, to the state, to those people who are funding this process. So it's something that I've been trying to explore, and I know that at School 7, we've come at it from a programmatic perspective, in that we're looking at reforming our program and developing student achievement, not coming from the academic perspective, but from the pushing of the arts into the academic perspective. So we're trying to develop that. So now how do I capture that? How do I look at qualitative data and quantitative data and say that we've made improvements? And so we've been wrestling with this, and we are going to get to the bottom of it. We've been wrestling with this, and I think it's something that once we have a handle on it, we'll be able to allow folks to understand the purpose of a professional development school and why it appears to some people to be so unorganized, because it is different.
Anybody want to answer her? Why is it different? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Well, while you're thinking about it, let me just add, Patrick, do you
I
want
just
to
want to
add?
add one comment, and I know this is a truism, but Joanne speaks so thoughtfully and obviously is truly wedded to the idea of a professional development school. And I think what makes a truly successful relationship is when both parties understand what they're about and they talk about the purpose that's driving them forward, so there's a common mission. And I think when there isn't that common understanding, the PDS is just not going to work. It will not be a successful relationship. So that connection with the school and the school having a voice at the table is essential. And you speak so well.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not really disagreeing with you, but I want to add just a little flavor to that. I think that the relationship is going to stay, I think back to Jane's graphic with the transactional, I think you talked about, that's where the PDS is going to stay in the type of situation you're talking about, not in the Joanne type of situation. That can be transformational. But oftentimes it's the transactional piece because we can't, if the school is confined to what the district says or the state says, then how do we take those bold steps to become innovative in what we're doing or take a chance? I think about, and hopefully this isn't true in your case, but I kind of think it might be. In Indiana, we are very tied to the state accountability, not just the federal accountability, but state, and the schools are worried about being taken over by the state. So if I have that worry and the teacher has the accountability with the new evaluation system of what's happening there, not only are they held accountable for their own classroom's achievement, but also the whole school's achievement. You know, you get a little bit worried about how bold you will be in going to that transformational step. And I was really taken by that that graphic, thinking, boy, how can we get there? Does trust trump that? I don't know. So, Joanne, how do you do it?
Well, I think that my district comes from a unique perspective that we don't have to worry about being taken over, because we were 20 years ago. We don't have that worry.
That's the answer, isn't it?
We've lived that for 20 years now. I believe we're going into our 20th year of takeover. And ultimately, we've come around, and we've always understood, those of us who are in the field, whose mission it was to be there and continue through this process of takeover, we understand, and I think others are now becoming more understanding of the fact that the responsibility for reform still lies with us. It does not matter who mandates what. The bottom line is it's the responsibility for the reform of the school belongs to the school leadership, and the staff that supports those children in terms of student achievement. So yes, there are parameters, there are constraints, there are all of that. But within that, we have to figure out how it is that we make it happen, because ultimately, the accountability is also going to lie with us. And we've lived that. So it's a unique situation that we come at it from. And the PDS has helped us to define that.
Carlene, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to ponder the thought that for as long as we are asking the question, we're allowing someone else to answer it for us. And it's okay to ask questions, but we must somehow, in that transformational mode, seek to become solution centers. And what the, the schools are being encouraged to respond to is that so-called cookie cutter model. And so when we can venture outside of the box to say, okay, I understand that from a state or even a national perspective, this is what's happening. These are my students. No one is going to ignore you when you say, this is my issue and this is what I see happening here, and have evidence to support your projected answer to what the problems are. And so, in so doing, you become proactive rather than reactive, and you become the innovator with the vision. And then you force the others to come on board in support of your idea, rather than you answering the question that for someone else, it's an agenda that does not satisfy your need. And so, it might be a very small corner of your world that you're working from, but eventually you will find that when the fear goes away, because that's what I'm hearing in your response, when the fear goes away, you'll find that there are more persons than yourself who share the same idea and have the same problem and are just looking for someone brave enough to say, let's take a closer look at this because this is what is relevant for us.
Well, you have very eloquently added. You very eloquently added to the issue that Jane raised in terms of courage, because these times in which we are finding ourselves living require courage at many levels, and this hybrid work that we do each and every day between the universities and the public schools, I think is a demonstration, not only a moral imperative, but it's a demonstration of professional courage from both our hand that goes out and the person who takes our hand and moves forward. And I have great respect for the folks of you in the audience and sitting here with us learning together about the work that we do together, because it's not easy work. And there are days that I know from our clinical instructors at Kane that it's discouraging work. And then there's the day when it's an absolute up. So join the conversation. Who has a comment or a question you'd like to ask the panel? Because what's your experience? What comments do you have about this professional development hydra or hybrid, whichever word you choose to use? And Lisa, I think Lisa Kruger from Rutgers, New Brunswick. I can barely see you back there.
Hi, I'd like to speak a little bit, touch upon what Joanne had mentioned a little bit earlier about colleges and universities being more research partners rather than teaching universities. And I guess I'd like to direct this to Candace and Jane. Can you tell me a little bit more about how PD work is valued at your institutions? In particular, for folks who are tenured faculty, is there a bifurcation? There's practitioners and researchers, or is the research work at PD schools, how is it valued at your schools?
I'm going on my second year here, and what I see as the PDS work, in some ways, I see that it's, in some ways, a little bit off-center from the core of the whole College of Education. But my goal, and this is where I say I hope to be a dream keeper someday, my goal is that it's at the very center of what we do. To me, it's like the theme that we keep circling back to and returning to. It's of vital importance. And so one of my goals is to continue, as I said, this sounds like one note, to get funds to support our work, because sometimes still there are administrative structures that don't always conform to what I want. I'll be honest. And so, it's hard. There's some affordability issues that I think we all struggle around. Another piece to the question about the research support piece, I see a real need to support faculty to get out and to work in tandem with the schools around the important questions. And my question today is, of the audience sitting here, is what are the questions? Who's going to answer them? And let's all take a piece, because everybody out here has rich experience, data, deep knowledge of some of these topics that Jane so adequately, I think, and wonderfully kind of encapsulates in this book. And so it's like, this is like my direct action impulse. It's like I want to do something with this. We know we have this. We have a rich professional development network in this state. And how do we get off the dime and frame the questions, and everybody takes a piece and move forward? So that's where I am. Yeah.
Jane, you want to jump in?
Well, I would say that that's definitely a vision for how your institution can work with the other institutions to really have a much bigger vision for research. At my institution, although it's received many accolades for being a leader in the PDS movement, we have always, at that level of the tenure track position, we've always honored the fact that the work that would be done in the PDS and the scholarship that would evolve from it would count towards promotion and tenure. Now, the scholarship, of course, has to end up in some product that would be a traditional product of being published in some reputable journal or outlet, American Educational Research Association, IRA, and CEC, whatever. And recently, our college had to develop its own promotion and tenure document that would be aligned with the State University System of Maryland's master document, as it were. And we have very specific things in there about the different kinds of activities and the different kinds of scholarly outputs that would count towards promotion and tenure. The problem probably for us is that we don't have a critical mass of people who are together, whether because we have a grant or because we have a structure, a committee, or what have you, that would say, we're working with all of these schools. What can we put together to answer some of those big questions to make a bigger statement? And, this is what Candace is alluding to. We don't have that at my place. In fact, it's only recently that we've had actually a PDS council for the college. According to the Maryland regs, each PDS is supposed to have a partnership steering committee, which is in-house, your principal, your teacher leaders, and your liaison from the university. But the universities do not necessarily have to have a bigger council because they work with, let's say, 4 or 5 school districts. So there's nothing there, there's no mechanism for that kind of a conversation, and so the research never really gets bumped up to what does the whole Towson PDS network want in terms of a research agenda. So you have people doing, faculty doing individual bits and pieces and small projects that may or may not fit their particular scholarly needs, and then getting that published. So we haven't really gotten the bang for our buck out of it, our setup. Now, people have gotten promoted, I certainly did, but fortunately, I was hooked more into the NCAPE PDS Standards project, and that was my entree into it. And then I was just talking earlier to Bernard down there, who's on the faculty, and I was saying that, for those of you who are who are tenure track faculty and have to do research and you're working in PDS schools, I would recommend that you join the PDS Research Special Interest Group, the SIG, at AERA. AERA has 100 SIGs, but one of them is the PDS Research SIG that was founded by Lee Teitel for this very purpose, that we would elevate the status of the work and the research that's done in PDS so that it would, meet the needs of the university.
Thank you. Anybody, Frank?
I just wanted to go back to the question about the relationship that we have, the clinical instructors, who have all been in the field as former superintendents and principals and supervisors. We had a few years ago a project that Martha had presented, and that's the teacher work sample. And this is a comprehensive research that we wanted our student teachers to complete during the student teaching process. Well, we initiated that ourselves, the clinical instructors. There were a few of us that piloted the program. We felt it was so valuable for our interns to have this massive review of what they've done. Martha and our team decided that it was something that should be done on campus as part of the capstone class. We would be secondary to the professors who were teaching the capstone. It made the capstone to us much more practical. Students were able to review things that they were actually doing, and forgive me, but not as philosophical as practical. And as a practical clinical instructor, I liked that. And Martha, we presented it to the dean, and the dean said, I like that idea. And that process has now gone back to the professors who are teaching the capstone, and we feel that was a great decision. And it really came from our work with the student interns, and it's now has been adopted by the university. So we felt very, very good about that connection.
Well, thank you, Frank. I had absolutely forgotten that. That is so institutionalized at Kane that I don't even think about it anymore. But there is another thing that Kane has done. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, Frank, because we were talking earlier about this. But Carlene, when you were speaking, you spoke about pre-assessment, post-assessment, being very cognizant of how well your students are doing. And that's the kind of language and kind of understanding we want our candidates to have, which is why we have also adopted the teacher work sample.
Thank you for that, because that's the reminder that we have to have, that we do have a common vocabulary, and that it is important that we speak with not only professional intentions, but in a professional vocabulary, so that we know what each of us are talking about. Candace, you want to add something? Oh,
I'm dreaming about picking on people in the audience. I don't know if that's fair or not.
That's absolutely fair, because I was ready to do that.
Okay, I'm thinking about Dina Sacchetti. I think she's a brilliant example of how a school can show an impact of a product or a project on student achievement. Dina, can I pick on you a minute, and would you share sort of your approach to documenting an impact? Forgive me, I'm sorry.
I work at Eastside High School, two of the schools at Eastside, the School of Information Technology and the School of Government. It's an absolute pleasure working there. And one of the things that we have worked on, different projects in different schools, the Reforms Grant at the School of Government, and what we have tried to do is work with diverse learners and integrate math, science, technology into the classroom. And what I've sort of done at both schools, the School of Information Technology as well, is take a look at student strengths, student weaknesses, and unfortunately, at this point, it kind of comes down to test scores. So what we have tried to do is develop what we're calling targeted intervention to help students improve their test scores, because you know, the high schools in New Jersey, they do have that high school proficiency assessment looming over them for graduation. And now, of course, the next big thing on the horizon is graduation rates. That's what schools are going to be evaluated on. So we're trying to incorporate all of these things into improving test scores, improving graduation rates. But we can do it through many ways, and right now we're working on, we did a lot with art this year in the School of Information Technology. And I need to talk to Nancy about a PowerPoint that we've got about the Multicultural Day PowerPoint that we did. I'm going to try and get hold of Nancy later on.
Thank you. Somebody else with a question or a concern, or would like to ask something of the panelists, or Jane, or whomever? Mr. Lampinen.
Thank you, ma'am. Jane, I had a question on one of your slides when you were dealing with the impact of PDS and how you documented that. One of your slides said something to the effect that there were instructional interventions that you could identify. Can you just tell us, if you remember, a few of those interventions, the type of things that were identified?
There were things, especially in literacy, working with bilingual children, in which faculty from the university worked with teacher candidates on using specific interventions with bilingual kids. Basically, all of these things were decided, they were customized, in other words, to fit the need of that particular school. So I couldn't say that it was one particular program, but it was something that was designed to meet the needs of those children, in which, as has been mentioned, utilizing all of the human resources in that school. Using teacher candidates not as people who were just practicing, but actually having their own impact on children under the guidance of university faculty co-teaching. Sometimes it's a three-way model. Those are the kinds, I know it sounds generic, but that is also part of the intervention. The way it is conceived and the way it plays out by using the expertise that is there. Finds that is part of the intervention for, children with special needs. It has been documented. Children who are ELL has been documented. And then an awful lot of stuff about just the tutoring, as I mentioned. But when you begin to see that the university is not coming in only to sort of be the supervisor or the dream keeper or the bridge builder, but actually having some participation in instruction in classrooms, whether it's through co-teaching, that gives you more impact for the intervention. These are very small studies, but there's no one particular program. And if they did use a particular approach, like response to interventions, very big in Maryland, it's always customized for that particular context, which makes it difficult to compare apples and oranges, because the context of this school over here is different than this one over here. I hope that answers your question.
I'd like to piggyback on that a little bit. Again, I go back to what is the strength of the PDS and how that helps us. An example of that for us at School 7 would be that based on the economic situation, we lost world language last year or 2 years ago as a program in the Patterson Public Schools. And so we began to think at School 7, well, we're a middle school, how's that going to impact our kids when they get to the high school, and what can we do? So our professor in residence, Joyce Kazan, is a native Italian speaker, and I also had another native Italian speaker, social studies teacher in my school, and we began to put together a program called International Studies, where Professor Kazan works with this particular teacher, and our kids are receiving world language through this International Studies program that we wrote, and they're all learning Italian. Why did I choose Italian? Well, our kids were learning Spanish when the district had it, but it was the resources that I had in the building that were the driving factor of, okay, so how do we take Professor Kazan's expertise, how do we take the teacher, marry that together, build a program, and meet a mandate, but also develop something different, which has been successful for us. The second piece of it is, I go back to the conflict the conflict that I'm having inside myself. Be sure to do your post data, your pre-data, your post data. You have to be able to show that this, is a different approach to world language at the middle school that may help you. We're also helping our program at the high school because we're interested in putting AP world language at the high school. So those students that are in this particular cohort of kids will eventually, if we can continue with this work, be candidates to go into Italian 2, and ultimately drive a need for AP Italian at the high school. So there were so many different thoughts that came into the development of this. Now, the idea of this is, am I going to be able to prove to people that this approach is going to be viable enough to move it forward into 3 or 4 years? But it all came out of the PDS process.
That's great. That's a great story. Thank you. Let me just add, anybody else who has something that they want to ask of the, please, Sharon.
And my question is sort of a segue to Principal Carzello's comments, and that's from the book, we know, and from other resources, that the teacher voice is not the most valued voice in the room currently. And so my concern is that the type of teacher research that may be generated, action research, for example, may not be the type of research that's valued by policymakers. So how do you envision teacher research making a difference to policy?
That's a big question, isn't
It is a big question.
Very big.
But it's really important. And I think that it needs to be, the history of teacher research or action research is that practitioners raise their own questions and concerns out of their own practice. And they engage in this scientific cycle in order to solve their own problems. And this process has been used, all over the world. It really drives professional development in many countries where the university is not involved with PD and you don't have big speakers coming in. It's more of, dare I say, a socialist approach to professional development for all kinds of skilled workers. It's also used to solve problems, social problems, and it's been used in Brazil and other nations with, homeless people, and it's been used in the medical profession and so forth. So it rises out of a genuine need. I think, however, in this case, when we talk about action research that's part of a bigger dynamic, a bigger wheel, where we're trying to provide evidence to policymakers, that the teacher's voice must be there, but it also should be more coordinated. Now, I'm not in favor of someone coming in, especially from the top down, with all due respect to those at the top, and I've seen this happen where a superintendent or a principal will come in and say, well, this year we're going to study X, Y, and Z. Everybody's going to do action research and it's on this. Well, that's not authentic, and you can't expect people to buy into that or be committed to it. But I do think there's a happy medium, especially when you already have this kind of trust and dialogue going on and shared interests, that there could be action research that everyone would make a commitment to, that you would have a design team, and those people would be responsible for the design and giving support, making sure that people have the things that they need in place in order to carry out the study and collect the data. It could be done at a much bigger level, and that's what you need. You need more. One study of my class of 30 children, and that's a lot, because sometimes these studies are like 5 or 6 kids. If we had hundreds of children and hundreds or at least tens of teachers looking at one question or a set of questions, and the design were the same, and they were using comparison groups, whether they're comparisons, in terms of children within the school, or better still, children from a different school that's not getting the PDS treatment. You have to think of PDS as the intervention. If you begin to get those kinds of data, then teachers would have a very big say. Now, it may not be a personal voice, and I think that there are outlets for that, such as conferences and other ways, sharing PD in the schoolhouse. But I think in order to affect policy, it has to be really designed as such and then carried out. And I haven't seen this yet occur anywhere in the country. Georgia State University
has had multiple teacher quality grants, partnership grants, so on and so forth. And they do have some kind of a meta-analysis. Because they're a research institution, they have the setup where they can plug in action research from teachers, on any subject, and do a meta-analysis to see, if there's a difference in student learning, whether it's math or science, it doesn't matter. But I still don't see that taking hold anywhere. I don't see that kind of advertised out there, or, people being invited to participate. The thing I don't like about that model, though, is that it's very prescriptive. They actually have a handbook, on how to set up your action research, and I don't think that's necessary. That's very much a research institution wanting to control the intervention, which is very, very typical. They want fidelity to the model. But I think that there could be a more collaborative approach. That's one extreme. But the other extreme is, letting people do what they want, which is good professional development for them, but it doesn't help the network go forward.
You have a question?
Yeah, the School of Education, why couldn't they be people in the forefront where you have research, publish or perish? Take these people that can do it on a graduate level or a doctoral level and have this ongoing relationship from the school to teach teachers how to do qualitative or quantitative research. Everybody is fearful of collecting data. We do it, there's permanent products collected all the time, teachers are used to that. But when you get to a place where they're not that comfortable, it's very frightening. And everybody wants proof that there's efficacy in the technique that you're using. So I think we were talking to the dean, and I teach here, I've been here since 1984. I'm in special ed. We collect data all the time. And so I think it'd be an easy thing to do. You have many people who are wonderful researchers here who can take the men and women that are going into the schools, plus the teachers, and at least get them grounded in the right way to go. I think we could do it very easily. I don't think it's that difficult.
I would just say, I think that's a very nice comment about our skills here at the university, but I do see research is such a two-way street. Two ways probably simplifying it, but, the questions have to come from all of us. The questions that are important to investigate, and then we put our skill sets together as to who is best to answer this piece of the question, who's better in this. And I do see, my brain, it's like I see a giant matrix, and there are all these questions each and every one of us wants to have some kind of information about. And it's like we decide as a group, who's going to look at this piece? Who's going to look at that piece? And how do we answer the things that matter most to us? And nobody sitting here at this university by themselves can ever know the answer to those questions. We've all had methods classes. A lot of us have taught them, but and we've taught research classes, statistics classes. But the question is what matters? What do we look at together? And you know what? It's a shame. It's a shame in a way that we have this book taking stock that shows over and over again how we don't have the answers to the fundamental things we want to know about. I think back to Ken Zeichner and company and Cochran Smith's book, Studying Teacher Education. This is like studying teacher education, professional development, take two. It's like, why don't we combine our forces to do something? So here I go again. And I'm very repetitive, my husband tells me. But I do think that's something that we have the will and the skills in a group like this to do. I don't know how many universities we've got here. I think I've counted 8 or 9. And how many schools? I didn't even count. But there are lots. And so the question to me is why not?
And why not now?
Yeah.
Peg, less comment.
Well, I think that you somewhat spoke to what I was saying, so I think it goes back to the whole tenure piece of it, that our PDS schools are a lab, and so why not combine those two, the person that's at the school from the university and the teachers working together, and get the teacher names on those research projects as well. And this may be a naive way to look at it, But I think part of the reason the teacher research hasn't been given the credit that's due is that we don't see it published in name, and there's just a lot of power in that. So just that little thing of saying the university person and the teacher working together and publishing those things so the name's out there, and then talking about it. We don't toot our horn. We just don't. I think that the term action research is somewhat diminutive. People say, oh, it's a little teacher question there. Maybe we need to get rid of the term action research. It's teacher research, it's research. And let the school boards know that this is information that drives what's going on in the classroom. This teacher made a decision to do this because it's working, and here's the proof that does so. I think we need to get that information out there and the teachers' names on that so that we build it into the professionalism of what's happening with teachers, so that it's not, as you started saying, that teachers are kind of shoved aside on that. We need to build that up, and I think that the universities can help with that voice.
Thank you, Peg. That's the last word for this panel. Sorry. But Nancy is standing here. I would like you to help me thank this panel for their thoughts and insights. And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.